Hi, I'm Ashish Soni. I design clothes for men and women. I've been doing fashion for the last 20 years. It's still very exciting. I do a very strong men's line in India, a lot of tailoring, a lot of men's clothing in terms of tailored products like suits and jackets. We also do a summer line which is a little more fun and easy, white shirts, textures, Indian techniques that we do on men's clothes. And my women's wear actually sells more outside of India than within India. It's more modern. Yes, there's a lot of Indian influence that I use. I play a lot with the Nehru collar. We've sort of contemporized that jacket. Traditionally, it used to be all closed and tight, but I think today the modern gentleman is doing a lot more with his life. So in fact, in certain places, it's almost replaced the black tie. And you've got those jackets with those collars selling across the world. In fact, I have many of my consumers are actually men outside of India who are actually buying those jackets. So it's just about key, interesting Indian details, whether it's an unusual button. So we use Nehru collar a lot, whether it's on shirts or on jackets. Traditionally, it's called the bangala, and we've sort of modernized it a little bit. I think the new Indian gentleman is, his lifestyle is very contemporary. So they're traveling a lot, the influences of the internet. So I think the idea is to still keep certain details which are Indian, perhaps buttons, perhaps the linings inside, which we sometimes print with fun Indian elements. But overall, the shapes are completely modern, so they can be bought by anybody across the world. Yes, most of the people that work with me on the men's line are people that I've trained over the last 25 years. And traditionally, they come from backgrounds of, when the British were here. That's why there's this whole tailoring tradition. There was a lot of tailoring that used to happen. All of them were getting their clothes tailored, including the Indian aristocracy at that point. And even if you go before that into the times of the Maharajas or the Mughals, everything was about luxurious fabrics, very well tailored clothing. So I think a lot of that tradition passed down. And so the idea I have is, a lot of it you want to retain as much of it as possible. And so I purposely work with a lot of these artisans and craftsmen and make sure that they move forward and retain what they've got from their ancestors. What I've done for Be Open is actually signature Ashish Soni. It's a lot of white on white. I've used a lot of Indian fabrics. It's very nice Indian cottons. I've used lawn, I've used fine voiles, and techniques that we've done on them, both in terms of the home line as well as the fashion, are old Indian techniques which I've done in contemporary ways. For instance, there's this age-old tradition of using strips of chiffon which are torn and then tied up and sewn onto a surface. But what I've chosen to do is contemporary, done it in a contemporary manner. And we've used safety pins that I've actually, woven into the fabric using these strips of chiffon. So that's what I like doing. The idea is there's always something interesting about giving something old a new twist. And I think that's where, that's what the West likes about me. For instance, that it's modern, but there's a lot of tradition in it. I think, that contradiction for me in terms of the way I approach things is what's worked for me for the last 10 years. So that I also think it makes things look new, yet beautiful. So this is what the West likes about me, the fact that I can handle this contradiction between something traditional and something contemporary when it's mixed together. And I think a lot of it is, I actually find it challenging, because you don't want to spoil things that are age-old and traditional. You want to present them, but you want to do it in a modern way. And I think that's the take that that's the way that I've always wanted to present what I do best. And there's a reason behind it, because it could be, I don't like pushing India into your face, but it needs to be said and done in an extremely subtle manner, where the message gets across. But the language that's spoken is completely global. So if you were to find the cushions that I've done in a house in New York or a house in Paris, they would still look extremely traditional and done and everyone would know that they're hand done, but they wouldn't scream India. And yet the elements which I've incorporated into doing those are completely traditionally Indian. The cushions that I've actually developed These are, we've done slightly bigger size pillows, and I've done 3 or 4 different techniques. One is where we've used the chiffon and the safety pins together. The other idea is where we've actually hand sewn on pearls white pearls onto a fabric. Thereafter, we've using heat transfers, melted the pearls so that they become like a flat surface. After that, we've used a printing technique on top of the melted surface. So it's almost like we've given one thing 3 different layers. And then the third technique is again something which is very simple to do but extremely time consuming. It's almost layering the way your muscle tissue is. So we've used pieces of very thin cotton, to cut them up into half-inch strips, and then layered them together and sewn them vertically. Normally what would happen is you'd see them sewn horizontally. So we've literally stacked them up next to each other, completely like muscle tissue, and sewn it all over a pillow. So I think that's where the modern element comes in. So the technique with which it's sewn is called Ari, which is very, very old, and it's actually from the Mughal period. But the interpretation that I've done of it is completely modern. So there's still, although they're a dying breed, for example, the ones that we have, their children no longer wish to do the same thing. So going into the future, yes, I'm a bit scared about how we're going to be able to preserve these traditions, but the ones that are still there, the idea is to work with them and kind of take their skills forward by incorporating ideas that even for them are fresh. For instance, letting them use their craft and their hands the way they know best, but giving them direction in a way that a consumer wants to buy that product so that it looks interesting for him, and it's not just traditional age-old techniques which they know. The idea is to incorporate a certain element of twist where the consumer finds it exciting enough to buy. There's a bit of both. I think that the challenge has been actually to teach them a lot of this over the years. Yes, sometimes you do face resistance because there are purists who say that, this is how I was taught it, then I don't wish to move from that. But I guess even they're realizing that a lot of it comes from the product has to sell at some point, and that's what's going to drive sales for us and business for them. So overall, I think yes, especially some of the younger ones are quite receptive to understanding how you wish to use the technique, but in a way that they've not done before. So I'm just hoping that sort of level of acceptance stays as we're moving forward into the next 10 or 20 years. A lot of them are the people that are actually in rural India, in perhaps small villages, or come from very poor backgrounds. Some of them, yes, eventually what happens is they want to move to the big cities and try to get jobs and live here. And so those are the guys we try to source. Sometimes we actually go back into the villages when we're looking for more people to hire. That's where we find them. It's not as if a lot of them are just hanging around in New Delhi, for instance. So, but I'm wondering how long we can sustain such a lifestyle, because the way India is growing with urbanization and a lot of these people wanting to get better jobs and finding that traditional handwork or handcraft techniques no longer pay them as well as, say, becoming a computer operator. So I don't know where it's going to be in the next 50 years, but for now we still have the options of going into interiors of India and trying to source a lot of this talent. There are quite a few design schools in India now, and I think perhaps at some level there are too many. And what's happening with them is that I think that approach to tradition and skill is still not being focused upon. It's more churning them out in terms of teaching them various different aspects of design, whether it's interiors or it's fashion or it's graphic or communication art. But specifically we would talk about teaching people how to preserve talent and move forward with tradition. That's where I see a big gap. In fact, even amongst the new designers, the ones who actually are making some kind of impact both in India or internationally, are the ones who are actually using tradition in some way or the other, incorporating it into their lines, whether it's home or it's fashion. And because that's what the consumer wants to see. If you can't go outside of India and try to sell something that, you know, for example, a consumer in New York is seeing, which is part of his everyday life, because he's like, I already have this and I have it from 20 other brands. Why would I buy it from you? So it's got to have a flavor that's unique, and which comes only when you incorporated some kind of traditional technique and presented it to a consumer in a modern way. When the brief came and I read about Be Open, and I sort of researched a little bit on what they'd done in the past, it was extremely exciting to know that first that this is happening in India and that we were hopefully going to be part of it. Conceptually, the idea was, you know, perhaps to go back to some extent into archives and see, okay, were there things that perhaps one had done which perhaps could never saw the light of day for reasons of either being you know, not commercial or not price effective or not you couldn't mass produce them. So, you know, that when we heard of all these words and felt let's look at things which are perhaps truly artisanal in form and nothing else. And there were a few which were very close to my heart, and a couple that we then also said, let's not only look at what we've already done, let's also try to create something completely from an open mind and see what we can do with it, which is where the 3-layered pearl printing concept originated. And the safety pins, for example, I'd done as small flowers on in one of my shows in New York about 5 years ago, and that collection sold really well. So I thought they were a small flower. Supposing I was to do it as an all-over technique, yes, it could have you know, make a lot of impact, and it would definitely catch eyeballs. That's how the approach to which the first thing was, it's actually an open platform, which is what I think any creative person really you know, dreams of, where there are no sort of barriers or restrictions or, you know, price points that one's got to follow. So I think that was one of the most challenging and exciting parts of being part of Be Open.